It was a clear morning in Dallas. Passengers were buckled in, and Delta Flight 1141 had just been cleared for takeoff. The flight was supposed to be routine and uneventful, but just 22 seconds after liftoff, the Boeing 727 slammed into the ground and burst into flames. Survivors ran through fire, a flight attendant died trying to open a jammed door, and a man gave his life trying to save his family. And it all started with one very preventable mistake. What went so wrong so fast? And why did the cockpit recordings trigger outrage across the entire airline industry? In this video, we will break down the true story of Delta Flight 1141, what went wrong, how it happened, and the changes it forced across the entire airline industry. So, stick around. This is one you don't want to miss. It was Wednesday, August 31st, 1988, a sunny and clear morning at Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport. Delta Flight 1141 had already completed the first leg of its journey from Jackson, Mississippi, landing smoothly in Texas just after 7:30 a.m. The aircraft, a Boeing 727-200, had no reported mechanical issues. Passengers for the next leg of the trip, Dallas to Salt Lake City, began boarding as usual. There were 101 passengers and 7 crew members. Nothing about that morning seemed unusual. But what was happening inside the cockpit was another story. Captain Larry Davis, First Officer Wilson Kirkland, and Flight Engineer Stephen Judd were in the flight deck. The flight attendants, Dixie Dunn, Diana George, Rosalind Marr, and Mary O'Neill, were going through pre-flight routines, checking seat belts, locking overhead compartments, and arming the emergency slides. The crew had already waited through a 25-minute taxi delay caused by wake turbulence precautions from an earlier departing DC-10. But instead of using that time to double-check systems and review checklists, the cockpit turned into something else entirely. For 7 minutes and 42 seconds before takeoff, the cockpit voice recorder captured a conversation that was anything but professional. The first officer led a string of casual and inappropriate topics, jokes about flight attendants, predictions about what the media would say if the plane crashed, and even references to the recent crash of Continental Flight 1713. At one point, he remarked that their cockpit chatter would give the media some kind of juicy tidbit if anything went wrong. The conversation shifted from dating habits to cocktail mixes to the presidential election. The captain barely chimed in, and the flight engineer remained mostly silent. What made this dangerous wasn't just the topics, it was the timing. Federal Aviation Administration (FAA) rules require a sterile cockpit below 10,000 feet or during critical phases of flight, including taxi, takeoff, and landing. That means no non-essential chatter. Delta had already begun implementing this policy company-wide, but the execution was clearly inconsistent. This cockpit was anything but sterile, and there's no evidence that the crew reviewed critical configuration checklists during this time. The presence of flight attendant Dixie Dunn in the cockpit during taxi further violated protocol. The conversation only stopped when the flight engineer gave the formal instruction for flight attendants to prepare for takeoff. At that point, Dixie returned to the cabin. No one in the cockpit re-verified the flap and slat settings. No one confirmed the takeoff configuration. The last thing recorded on the SEV-ER before the engines spooled up was a cabin full of relaxed confidence and a cockpit full of distractions. And then the aircraft was cleared for takeoff. 22 seconds later, that relaxed atmosphere would turn into a fireball. At 8:59 a.m., Delta Flight 1141 was finally cleared for takeoff from runway 18L. The Boeing 727's engines roared as it began its roll down the runway. From the outside, nothing seemed wrong. The plane accelerated normally. Passengers were strapped in. The flight attendants were seated in their jump seats. The cabin was calm. That calm lasted only until the aircraft's main wheels left the ground. Seconds after liftoff, witnesses on the ground and passengers on board reported a sudden and violent shaking. The aircraft rolled sharply to the right wing dipping in a way that didn't match any normal flight behavior. One passenger, Michelle Christensen, later told reporters, The minute we took off the ground, I knew we were going to crash. Another, Jim Hammack, who was seated in an exit row, described breaking into a cold sweat as the plane bounced in the air and lurched sideways. The tail of the plane hit the runway, an instant sign that something had gone very wrong with the takeoff configuration. This was followed by loud compressor surges from the engines, caused by disturbed airflow over the rear-mounted turbines. The crew tried to maintain altitude, but the aircraft was unstable. Just seconds into the climb, the right wing clipped the airport's instrument landing system localizer antenna, located around 900 to 1,000 feet beyond the runway. That collision triggered an external fire and caused the right wing to break apart. The aircraft veered off course and began to disintegrate. It slid sideways, smashing into the ground, leaving behind an 800-foot trail of wreckage. Engine number 3 was torn from the fuselage. The force ripped the cabin open in several places. Jet fuel leaked and ignited instantly, sending a wall of fire up through the rear of the aircraft. The entire flight lasted just 22 seconds from liftoff to final impact. In those moments, the fuselage broke apart like aluminum foil. Passengers were thrown against seats, windows, and overhead bins. Some escaped with bruises, others were trapped in the rear where the fire spread fastest. The smoke began to fill the cabin within seconds, and visibility dropped to near zero. In total, 14 people died, 12 passengers and 2 flight attendants. Dozens more were injured. Survivors described a terrifying scene of fire closing in, people screaming for help, and exits jammed or blocked by flames. One man who made it out alive ran back in to save his family. He succumbed to his burns 11 days later in the hospital. Despite the fire and chaos, 94 people survived. That number could have been much lower if not for fast decisions, human instinct, and the sacrifice of those who stayed behind to help others. The smoke killed more people than the crash itself. In the end, it was a race against time and against fire. This wasn't a long-haul disaster. It was over almost before anyone could process it. So, what happened to Delta Flight 1141? Let's examine why the plane never stood a chance from the moment it rolled down the runway, revealing the checklist errors, silent alarms, and the mechanical silence that doomed Flight 1141. When investigators from the NTSB began piecing together the wreckage of Delta Flight 1141, they weren't just looking for broken metal or scorched wires. They were trying to understand why a Boeing 727, a workhorse of commercial aviation, failed to climb after takeoff. It didn't take long before they focused on one critical detail: the flaps and slats weren't deployed. On a Boeing 727, proper takeoff configuration includes extending the flaps and slats to generate additional lift at lower speeds. Without them, the aircraft has to rely on raw engine thrust and a dangerously steep angle of ascend to leave the ground. That's exactly what Flight 1141 attempted, and it led to disaster. Investigators found the flap jack screws still in their fully retracted position, confirming that they had never been extended. The flight data recorder didn't show any change in configuration, and the cockpit voice recorder made it worse. Both pilots verbally confirmed that the flaps had been set, but there was no mechanical sound of the lever being moved. This mismatch between what the pilots claimed and what the data showed was damning. There was also a backup system meant to prevent exactly this situation. It's called the Takeoff Warning System, TOWS. If a pilot pushes the throttle forward without the aircraft in proper takeoff configuration, an alarm should sound. But on Flight 1141, that alarm never went off. The NTSB dug deeper and discovered why. Years earlier, Boeing had issued guidance allowing airlines to modify the TOWS to prevent nuisance activations during taxi. Delta applied that change to its fleet. The version installed on this aircraft used a switch triggered by throttle position, and it was prone to intermittent failure. That defect had gone undetected during maintenance. After the crash, the FAA ordered a fleet-wide inspection of all Boeing 727s and found 35 aircraft with similar issues. The TOWs on Flight 1141 never activated because of that malfunction and because of how it had been modified in the first place. There was no evidence of mechanical failure elsewhere in the aircraft. The engines were relatively new and in good condition. The airframe wasn't flawed. The only thing missing was the correct takeoff setup. When the NTSB wrapped up its investigation into Flight 1141, it listed 2 clear causes. The crew failed to set the flaps and slats, and the takeoff warning system didn't sound. But buried in the final report was something deeper. The crash wasn't just about one cockpit mistake. It pointed to cracks across the airline, and the agency meant to regulate it. Delta had known for years that it needed stronger crew resource management, CRM. This is the system that teaches pilots how to work together, communicate under pressure, and keep focus during critical flight phases. By 1988, some airlines had already made CRM standard. Delta had started, but the rollout was slow. The pilots on Flight 1141 had not received proper CRM training. That lack of structure meant no one in the cockpit called out the mistake. No one double-checked the configuration. The captain didn't stop the off-topic chatter. The culture didn't demand it. But when the cockpit voice recorder tapes were released, people were shocked at how casual the pilots sounded before takeoff. The backlash was immediate. Pilots across the country pushed back. They said it was a breach of privacy and a misuse of sensitive data. That outrage eventually shaped U.S. law. After 1141, new rules restricted how CVR recordings could be shared. The government still uses transcripts in investigations, but the audio is now protected by federal statute. Flight 1141 didn't just expose a training issue. It showed how relaxed oversight and slow corporate change could lead to real, deadly consequences. So, what's your take on this? Could a simple checklist have saved Delta 1141? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. And if you found this video insightful, give it a thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives into aviation's most shocking moments. Until next time, stay curious and stay safe in the skies.